Welcome to the Regulation Podcast, brought to you by the Institute of Regulation. Once again, we hope this podcast will help you understand what regulation is all about, what it's all for, and of course, why it matters to the public. My name is Anthony Oliver, and I'm going to lead today's discussion as we look at how we train the next generation of regulation professionals. And to do that, my guest today is Martin Lodge, Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the London School of Economics. Now, Martin runs the Institute of Regulation's new two-day Fundamentals of Regulation course, which is specifically designed as a foundation for regulatory professionals and aimed at those who are new to the profession or have only a limited experience in the sector. Now, it's fair to say that Martin covers a huge amount of ground on this course on a range of subjects such as standards, enforcement, risk assessing and public and consumer engagement, and delves into decades of his experience in regulation, experience which has led him to be known as one of the leading scholars of regulation. So let's find out more. Martin, thanks for joining me today on the Regulation Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Well, so Martin, as I explained, you lead the Institute's Fundamentals of Regulation course. I mean, this covers a range of topics, as I said, and aimed at those who are new to regulation. I mean, how do you explain the course? Why is it needed?
Well, there are three fundamental reasons or rationales for this course. So one is to allow participants to discuss and introduce some key concepts that might have been seen in a memo or somewhere, but to sort of point to the prerequisites and the origins of these key words. The second one is to put one's own work into the broader context of regulatory activity, to see how this all might or might not make sense in the broader scheme of things. And the third one, and a very important one, is to also be able to be in a setting where one can constructively discuss one's own experiences with other regulators from other sectors.
Okay. I mean, you've written and spoken a huge amount about better regulation. I mean, regulation that works better for citizens and better for governments. I mean, how do you describe this word better? I mean, is it simply about outcomes or service outcomes and lower costs? Or is there more at stake?
Well, over the past few decades, one could have pointed to a number of better and smarter regulation initiatives in governments across the world. And this is not what is really meant by better regulation in the context of this course. So here, what better regulation really is trying to get at is to think about a process of probing, to openly acknowledge the prerequisites for different regulatory interventions, to consider alternatives, and to openly confront trade-offs, and therefore to come to a better understanding of the prerequisites for different types of regulatory systems, and thereby develop courage in being able to judge what might be the most appropriate regulatory intervention in a particular case. Okay.
Well, let's talk a bit about some of the things you go through on the Fundamentals of Regulation course. I mean, one of these outcomes that you're trying to leave delegates with is, an understanding of regulatory theory. What is regulatory theory? Is this different across different sectors and different industries?
Well, I think the key understanding of regulatory theory here is to probe into the concepts, to not just study case studies for their own sake, but to look into the different theoretical assumptions between different interventions, between different management strategies, and so on. So to really develop a broader understanding of the prerequisites and the ideas about capacities and motivations that are essential for regulatory practice.
Well, building on that, you also help delegates evaluate different regulatory approaches and concepts. So just talk us through how you describe some of those different approaches. Again, is it as simple as differentiating between encouraging and enforcing behaviours? Again, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think sort of one of the dominant themes in regulation over the last 30 years or so has been this idea about, let's call it enforced self-regulation, this idea that we should treat regulated entities as potentially responsible, as a primary unit that can mitigate against particular harms, and therefore the kind of regulatory strategy that is needed is to encourage reflection as a unit of the regulated entity rather than what people like to call command and control via adversarial relations. And this course tries to probe into this kind of understanding of the different strategies that are being associated with this idea about enforced self-regulation, and therefore to help also to develop a greater appreciation of the inevitable tensions that one encounters when one embarks on this type of regulation.
So this is about, I mean, we've spoken before with some of my other guests about carrot and stick. Is that a concept that you kind of come across?
Well, in many ways, it is about using you might say, the carrot first, but in the shadow of a benign big stick, you may want to call it. So the idea is, it is possibly credible that if one is on a repeated way, you might say gaming or cheating or whatever one might want to call it, that there is a threat attached, there is a probability of detection, and there is a probability of being sanctioned against. But at the same time, there's a fundamental assumption about that regulated entities should be encouraged to think responsibly about their processes rather than think irresponsibly about the way to game the regulator in not detecting wrongdoing.
Okay. I mean, fundamentally, this is about people learning a set of skills they can use beyond, I suppose, the academic theory and actually taking it into their everyday work. I mean, you hope that delegates will apply this analysis, and you also say with confidence. I mean, what are the key aspects of this successful outcome for them? Actually applying it with confidence. Is success built on rigorous process, or is it a more intuitive understanding of people and behaviours, perhaps?
I think it's both, in a sense. I mean, it's not a fundamental belief about here's sort of the piece of paper and a structure that will lead to a great outcome. But what therefore is possibly more important, and that is what I mean by confidence, is to say we are able to think about different regulatory strategies by openly acknowledging inherent vulnerabilities or Achilles heels, and here are strategies to try to mitigate against them rather than shuffling the document somewhere elsewhere to hope that someone else will take a tricky decision. So in that sense, judgment and confidence is both, you might say, an individual informal craft capacity, you may want to call it, but it should also be situated, you might say, in organizational structures that encourage a conversation to allow for individuals within a regulator to reflect on their activities, possibly beyond their own unit or their own division, because what is sort of really critical about this course is that very often regulation happens within units and people don't talk across units within an organization because time is poor, but also regulators don't talk across their different regulatory regulatory authorities, you might say. And again, where learning might be very important.
Yeah, and that whole idea of, I suppose, building confidence is so important because quite often it's quite an adversarial environment that you're working in there. You've got to have the confidence that you know what you're talking about.
It is, and I think sort of the adversarial environment is twofold. One is an inherent skepticism. You might say, what is this regulator going on about? But also, one might say there are strategies to avoid adversarialism by saying we want to have a conversation about the underlying regulatory philosophy here, about sort of the guiding principles that sort of lead for this kind of intervention to happen without necessarily highlighting, therefore, that one would like to be accommodating towards a regulated. So one can be tough while being not too distant from one's own regulated target population.
Great. Now, well, let's talk about some of the specifics that you delve into in the course. I mean, start with standard setting. There's an economic, there's a political, social balance to get right. Who do you think should be leading that process of standard setting?
Well, I think one of the key ambitions across regulators is to be principle-based, and everyone would like to be principle-based because we all have, of course, fantastic principles. But I think here, in order to develop these principles, which clearly you might say comes from a regulator, but still what is fundamental to is a regulatory conversation with also the targets of regulation. So in that sense, you might say where exactly the standard comes from might be quite difficult to determine because of this need for an ongoing conversation between what you might say is the fundamental authority, which might be the regulator if given the jurisdiction to do so, to set standards, and you might say the target population that tries to make sense of this. And again, the argument here has to be, if one wants to use regulatory standard setting with confidence, it is about this willingness to engage with one's jurisdiction in developing these shared understandings.
So that in many ways is bringing in the communities that you're acting for, as well as I suppose the industries and the private sector that is delivering them.
Which is fundamental about the session about engagement processes, where here the idea is how can we make regulated entities more responsive to the people they're supposed to serve.
Okay, a bit more about that later on. But second, let's talk about enforcement. We mentioned this stick-carrot relationship. I mean, how important would you say that enforcement is for regulation? You know, both getting it right, but also getting that balance right between enforcement and encouraging behaviours.
I think that is one of the fundamental issues we discuss in this unit on the course. It is between, on the one hand, having you might say, a credible threat that something nasty might happen to you if one is not following one's obligations, but at the same time, to start with assumption about sort of how can we encourage responsible, you might say, restoration. So how can we make organizations of whatever kind capable to basically follow regulatory obligations without necessarily assuming that everyone is out to cheat and to basically violate regulatory standards.
Right, because there are in many examples, I suppose, in life today, there are calls for a tougher regime to be applied. I mean, is it fair to say that we've the regulation has become weak?
Not necessarily. Indeed, one can see a trend towards more deterrence. But I think what is sort of fundamental before one sort of says regulation should be harsher, which might be about higher likelihoods that one gets detected, as well as the ultimate sanction might be sort of become more punitive. But I think what is really important for having you might say a regulatory craft or regulatory analysis perspectives to say, or is to have a good understanding about how do we think about our target population? Do we think they're just all out there that need trying to game the system and therefore need to kind of speak harshly, or do we have a spread of individuals or units here which basically might require different type of regulatory enforcement actions, which then puts great strain on developing the type of process which can be accommodating to these very different, you might say, capacities and motivations inside the regulated population.
Which brings us nicely to this third area, which is you talk about public and consumer engagement. You mentioned it earlier. I mean, it's a difficult thing to balance, bearing in mind, at the moment, where we are at the moment with, say, the water industry. There's a lot of public outcry about water quality, energy pricing. Are we getting a good deal? School standards. There's issues around the rail sector. And we're clearly not getting or entirely getting this right. What's your advice for engaging better with the consumers?
Well, I think there are sort of two challenges here. One is, you might say, how do regulators engage, you might say, with different populations they are being serving, and how can this be a meaningful challenge process, both in the sense of here's our annual report, what do you think about it, but also in developing possibly understanding of regulatory priorities and possibly even explaining regulatory strategies. And then there's a second strain here, which is about how can regulators encourage regulated entities to become more responsive to their consumers rather than be fundamentally concerned about how to deal with their inspectorate or their regulator.
Yeah. Well, let's move on from that, Martin, and talk a bit about you. You're an academic at LSE. How would you describe your day job?
Well, the day job is a fascinating, is a brilliant one at most times, because it's ultimately about being able to research phenomena that are of significance. It's an ever evolving sort of system. And it's also about teaching this material sort of in the broader sense, public management and public policy in the context of regulation, which again is wonderful to teach these kind of ideas to a set of international students who bring in plenty of ideas from different disciplines and both from a very diverse international background, which doesn't mean one is just stuck in a global north little island context.
Which, of course, I mean, your background, you grew up in Germany. Does that international background help? In
many ways, this is why I think what gets me out of bed, you might say, in terms of regulation, it is, on the one hand, the the interplay between different disciplines, or what you might want to call it the economic logics, the legal logic, you might say call it a behavioral logic, in the kind of the problem of regulation across different domains. It is also to see how, or to be curious about the differences in regulatory approaches across different sectors, but also to look at the differences in regulatory approach across different countries. My PhD was about railway regulation, so train spotting material, and to see there how the conversations in the German archives versus the British archives, to see these differences at the very same time when one would assume there should be shared ideas and so on. Seeing these differences evolve was fascinating.
I imagine there's some fascinating comparisons between the German railways and the British railways as well.
Plentiful, yes, if I wanted to. Yeah, indeed. All of them are attracting a lot of complaints, one should say. Yes.
Well, let's not talk about the French railways. No. Some might argue that, I suppose, that regulation has a bit of a reputation for being quite a rigorous and very structured discipline. What drew you towards it?
I think it was, to some extent, the moment in which, sort of doing a PhD at the time when regulatory agencies in an age of privatization became sort of dominant. So one could see, at the time, there was much interest in the regulation of privatized utilities in the UK, and seeing that as sort of an international trend. One could see at the time the trend of regulation as a distinct activity, with oversight bodies also moving inside regulation. So that's where the Ofsteds and, the increasing watchdog activities of the National Audit Office, all of these things seem to become more dominant. And that struck me as a fascinating area to spend the rest of my life in. Not that I knew it at the time, but yes.
But is it about, for you, is it about this whole idea of doing social good? Is it about trying to make change? Are you a consumer champion at heart?
I think times change. I think initially one would say there's primarily an academic interest in this kind of concept and so on. But of course, the more one gets exposed to this world, the more one engages, you might say, with the world of practice, the more one gets, you might say, put into the position to engage with these open questions. So I wouldn't say that I have a particular normative focus on, how should regulation should be. I see myself more as, you may sort of see as sort of in Greek tragedy, like the choir that basically sort of tries to sing, a few tunes and sort of to ask the unhelpful questions in a friendly way to sort of help the conversation along. I think that is what I see more my role as.
Good. Well, I have to ask, I suppose, what do you do when you're not being an academic? Then are you in the choir singing there at the back? No. What do you do when you're not being an academic?
Well, I have a young family, so bad singing is part of my life. But ignoring that, you might find me singing badly on a football terrace at some point, or listening to some music.
Any particular football terrace?
It is the football club of Fulham, which attracts my usually more moaning than celebratory singing. Yes.
Not necessarily an easy pastime, as I say, One
doesn't choose football teams. A bit like regulation, one doesn't do it for the celebration, one does it for the occasional happiness that one isn't suffering.
I'll stick with that one. Let's get back to the Institute of Regulation, Martin. I mean, clearly the IOR is helping professionals become better practitioners, via your course. But how else do you see this organisation really helping the world of regulation?
Well, I am somewhat separate to the institute, but all I can, as someone who's observed its emergence, I think there was clearly a need that was identified, that there would be some body which tries to bring together, in a practitioner sense, different regulatory bodies, not just as you might say, a lobbying or advocacy group, but also as a venue for an exchange. And that was a need that clearly needed to be met, and the Institute has done a great job in the past few years to fill this role.
Okay, and any particular groups of people that it really should be working on trying to influence and reach out to really start to change the world of regulation in the UK?
Well, I think there are sort of three audiences here, one might say. One is, you might say, to be a professional body of regulators that, you might say, advances a general view about sort of how regulation should be viewed as an essential part of, you might say, the toolkit of government rather than something terrible in that sense. The second, you might say, is the audience of regulatory entities themselves to be a venue to basically allow for this open conversation at all levels of seniority, you might sort of say. And then you could say there's an audience which is, you might say, the more general public, which basically, or opinion shapers, as one might want to call it, which basically sort of to be, you might say, the point of contact for conversations about the rationale for particular regulatory intervention and so on, without necessarily sort of trying to discuss a particular regulator's performance, but to offer, you might say, a more sort of background conversational piece.
Right. Which I suppose comes to this whole idea you mentioned earlier about trying to improve collaboration between regulators, between different sectors.
Indeed. And within that, you might also say to support people who work in the field of regulation to see the potential for collaboration across different regulatory areas, or to see scope for learning across different bodies.
Okay. A few general issues just to close out, Martin. I mean, politics is embedded in regulation. The government has this ongoing smarter regulation program, which is about reforming and making regulation fit for the future, but also talks about making regulation a last resort, not a first choice. I mean, what does that mean to you? I mean, is it a deliverable or even a desirable ambition?
Well, we've been here before, so there's been, since Michael Heseltine, so many bonfires of red tape that one has to be surprised that there's still some out there in that sense. But I think, all of these better regulation initiatives or deregulation agendas or whatever the word might have been at a particular time, they fundamentally are challenged by the issue that better regulation is about, you might say, doing things with less resource intensity and, simplifying procedures and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, it is about, you might say, issues of fairness. And it's also about sort of trying to have what we might want to call resilience for the purpose of this conversation. So having systems in place that don't collapse at any single time. And I think ultimately government too wants, you might say, these contradictory objectives in that sense. That will always be in tension. So whatever one does with better regulation agendas and so on, as long as there's no acknowledgement that ultimately all regulatory activities tries to do, you might say, contradictory things at the very same time, there will always be criticisms. And therefore, my argument is better regulation is acknowledging these trade-offs rather than believing that one single instrument will solve all these problems.
Right, yeah. We've got a general election, of course, coming down the track. I mean, any thoughts about how regulation might prepare for a potential change in government and administration?
Well, I think the bigger challenges will still the same. One is if one wants to, and one will need to, think about a transition to a different type of economy in the name of climate crisis and all that. There's an issue here about sort of how different domains will be affected by decisions about sort of net zero, let's call it like that. There will be, I suspect, still a continued concern about how is regulation supporting a government preference, if it still is a preference, about balancing out the economy between different parts of the country. And there will also be a fundamental question here about how regulation can deal with depleted public services and demoralized public service staff. And there again, I think there will be plenty on the desk for a conversation between politicians and regulators in that context.
Okay. I also spoke recently to Mark Sutton at the CQC about the use of data and technology in regulation. I mean, how do you see the opportunities and risks presented by technology, in particular the growing use of and influence of generative AI, artificial intelligence tools?
I think across sectors, let's say the use of AI by regulated entities, and in my world this would be students, you could say, will require fundamental rethinking about sort of how we deliver public services, how do we examine even capacity and so on. I think that on the one hand you might say there's a question for regulators to what extent they want to encourage regulated entities to have these views, or whether one should just stand back and hope for the best that this is happening. And then there's sort of a second part of the business, you might say, which is, you could say, a more of a role also for the Institute of Regulation, maybe to think carefully about the regulation of and by algorithms. So, kind of one is sort of how do entities use all of these kind of new technologies, but also by algorithm to make sure that there's enough probing into the data quality, that there's an acknowledgement of the complexity, that the human side in this regulatory conversation is not being missed out because somehow the computer says one thing, and so on. So how regulators are, you might say, sort of have to jump on the bandwagon without being sort of completely blind to the challenges of this would be sort of one of the big questions for the next 5 years or so.
Okay, the other thing that all the podcasts I think I've recorded with regulation professionals, they've all talked about the need to ensure both the independence and the accountability of regulators. Any thoughts about how that can be improved? Again, who's got to take the lead in that?
Well, there's different social science disciplines would have different views on this sense. And empirically, you might say one of the biggest puzzles is that usually regulators would like to be quite accountable. And usually the people who hold to account are not that interested in holding to account unless there's a scandal or a crisis. So there might be, so we might sort of need to think about that relationship between those who want to be independent, want to be accountable, and those who are skeptical about regulation, don't really want to hold to account. So there's one puzzle here. But I think sort of more generally, I suppose the kind of key question is, and again, this sort of leads to questions about sort of for regulators, is how to generate, you might say, a reputation for being competent, that basically one is perceived as legitimate, not just by the world of politics, but also more generally. And I think sort of thinking carefully as a regulator about these kind of elements is important. And I'm not quite sure whether the word independence, therefore, is particularly helpful, because on the one hand, of course, the key idea behind regulatory agencies was operational autonomy from the immediate ministerial decision-making and so on, whereas independence sometimes is sort of seen as a threat to politicians who think there's these unaccountable things out there, or regulators think, or people inside regulators think, well, independence means we don't have to pay much attention to the government of the day. And I think sort of the important part, which I think again is sort of a trend over the last 15 years or so, is a growing recognition of the interdependence of regulation between different parts, where you might say independence is a difficult concept to have.
And there's always a difficult balance to strike as you go through that. Finally, we spoke a little about international comparators. I mean, how do you think we're getting on in the UK compared to other parts of the world when it comes to regulation? Should we be sharing or exporting best practice, or looking elsewhere to import ideas?
Well, I think on the one hand, I think one of the key themes we will see in the next 5 years or so will be something called regulatory diplomacy. So how do we share standards or make sure that the standards we would like are maintained rather than challenged by another geopolitical entity? So that's sort of one question here about sort of the importance of this international piece will be becoming increasingly significant again, I think. But I think sort of rather than talking about best practice and so on, what I think is essential for regulators in the UK, but also elsewhere, is not to think, well, where's sort of the best example we want to sort of pick from, but it's more to think about how do other countries try to solve this problem? What are sort of the mechanisms they employ for doing so, and how could we make it work over here in that sense? So being a bit more questioning about sort of what are the lessons from elsewhere rather than what are the websites we might sort of copy and paste. That is, I think, the key part for being a learning regulatory environment. That's
an interesting challenge you've set there for the profession, and a great place to finish. So thanks so much, Martin, for joining me today on the Regulation Podcast. As I say, a very interesting time for regulation. So thanks for sharing your thoughts today. A quick reminder to end with, I mean, how do people get involved in one of your courses? How often do you run them, and where are they?
The aspiration by the Institute is to run these courses twice a year. At the moment, the aspiration is to run them mostly in London, but I don't think that is necessarily a fixed place. And I think the key way to get engaged is to watch out for the Institute emails and websites where there will be announcements of the dates and the terms and conditions for these kind of courses.
Great stuff. Well, do reach out to Martin and to the IOR if you want to get involved or hear more about this course or other courses from the Institute of Regulation. So in the meantime, Martin, thanks so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Great. That's all we've got time for today, though, unfortunately. So if you haven't done so already, do visit the IOR website. That's www.ioregulation.org, where you'll find a huge amount of really useful information about the Institute, about how you can get involved, and of course about all the courses that they run and the seminars that are being put together to help the regulation sector. And of course, you'll find details of all the latest podcasts, which you can listen to and, of course, share. So thanks for joining us today, and thanks again to Martin. And on behalf of the Institute of Regulation, I look forward to seeing you again very soon.